Hey everyone, and welcome to this Hedera Python playlist that I've been putting together. And in this video, we'll be doing some pretty cool stuff with Hbar, like transferring it from one account to another account. So this is kind of the fruits of our labor, because the previous 4 videos that I've put together in this playlist is all about setting up our machine, playing around with an SDK, configuring a client, and creating an account. So all necessary stuff, so please look back at those videos to get caught up to get to this point. But in this video, like I say, we're going to be transferring Hbar, which is pretty cool, right? So before I jump into it, if this is the first time you visited Dig Coding, then please subscribe and click that bell so you're notified every time I put a new video on the channel. And also leave me a comment, because those comments help me steer this channel to make sure I'm creating content for you that you will enjoy. And in the description below, if you have a look, there's a link to my Patreon page and also my Hbar wallet. So if you want to ping me some money or ping me some Hbar to help me support me and the channel to create better content at a quicker pace, then by all means, it will be welcomed and it will help me out massively. So that's got that out of the way. Shall we jump into it? Look at my screen. So it opens up straight on the docs.hedera.com website. So these are the docs that we've been going through, and in this one we will be going through the transfer Hbar page, link to which will be in the description below. But we'll just quickly go through this. What I want to avoid is keep going backwards and forwards between a Python file and the website. So we'll just read through this quickly and just make sure that we're on the same page. So this is all about transferring Hbar. So it says, in this section, you will learn how to transfer Hbar from your account to another account on the Hedera test network. Well, actually, we'll be doing it the other way around. So we'll be transferring Hbar from a customer to us for transfer of goods, for instance. Prerequisites. So it's saying to go through all of the docs that they've, and their docs are pretty good. So go through them. Also look at my videos, because I'm following this and creating content. So have a look at those as well. So step 1, create a transfer transaction. So like I've previously mentioned in other videos, we are working with the Java SDK because the Python SDK as of today's date isn't quite ready yet. So we're having to interpret Java and think about how we can work with it in Python. So in this one, we need to bring in transfer transaction from the SDK that we've already installed. And essentially, what we're doing is we are creating or instantiating the class, and then we are sending an amount of tinybar. So let me open it up. So if I just go denominations Hedera, it will come up with the official denominations. These will also be in the description, by the way. But with Hbar, you don't just have Hbar, you have millibar, microbar, and tinybar, which are smaller denominations, and then you have the bigger ones, which are kilobar, megabar, and gigabar. Okay, so when we're on here, what we're using is the Hbar class that we've brought in, or we will be importing, and it's from tinybars. So this is 1,000 tinybars that we'll be deducting from the sender account, and we'll be sending it to the receiver account. So you can see it has to be the same number. One's a positive and one's a negated version. So 1,000 positive and a minus, 1,000 positive and negative 1,000. And it has to be identical, else it just won't work. And also then you have the .execute method, and you pass through it the client. Now, the client you pass through must be the client that is sending the Hbar. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. So we'll be creating this. I'll be writing a Python class to work with this piece of code here, or in the docs. You then got step 2. So we need to verify that the transfer transaction reaches consensus, which is a huge part of Hedera Hashgraph, because it can reach consensus, actual finality, very, very quickly, within about 5 seconds, I believe. So being able to do this in Hedera Hashgraph is a huge plus point anyway. So we'll be running this piece of code. So we'll be using the getReceipt method. And from that, we will be able to make sure that the transaction actually occurred, it reached consensus, and we can get the receipt and the balances from that. So that's step 2. Step 3, get the account balance. There you go. So 3.1, get the cost of the requesting the query. So there's a fee. Okay, although when I was playing around with this earlier, the fee kept coming out as 0, so I was having to do a very rudimental calculation between the sending balance or the start balance and the end balance, but you know, that will only improve. So we use the account balance query, we pass through the account ID, and we pass through the client to get cost, and it will give us the cost of the query. Then 3.2, get the account balance. What are we doing there? So we're looking at the account balance query, passing through account ID, and then execute and passing through the client. And that will give us the balance of that account. Now we want to do that twice. We want to do it at the start of the transaction and at the end of the transaction. So you can see what the balance was and what the balance has become after the transaction. We'll do it for us and we'll do it for the client. So we'd make 4 calls to that class when we write it, so you can see that it did actually occur. So let's say one Hbar was moved from client A to client B. So the balances went down on one and up on the other, and there would be a transaction fee. So that's what we're going to do today. Okay, so what we'll do, look, I'm not going to keep flicking backwards and forwards to the website because it gets a little bit clunky, but this is the link. It'll be in the description below. When you're playing around with the code, keep referring back and hopefully you can see what we're doing. But I've already built this in a previous kind of, not a tutorial, but in a kind of a few Python files, just to make sure that when I'm creating this video that it all actually works and it's all seamless. So I'm going to be using those notes. I'll be typing out a lot of it, but copy and pasting some across because my typing is terrible. And at the end, we will test it just to make sure that it all works. So that is enough of the website. Let's open up my text editor of choice, which is Sublime Text. Other text editors are available, but this is it. You can see what I've done. I've created a directory called Hedera Demo 3. That's essentially what it will be called when I put it on GitHub later. In the last video, linked to which is just up here, we got to the point where we were creating an account. And the previous video before that was we were configuring a client. So we will be using these, but we'll be expanding on them in this tutorial because we're working with 2 clients. So we create our own testnet client. So that's using the operator ID and the operator private key. And that's us, right? So, but because we're going to be transferring, we need 2 clients. So we need to create an account, a fictitious account, give it some Hbar, some balance, and then transfer it. So that's what we were doing there. So we need to expand on this get client, and we'll do that first because when we're importing get client to these other PY files, we want the ability to select either us as a client or a fictitious client, i.e. create a new account. So that's what we'll do now. So what I'll do is I will copy this across because I did create this video earlier and it took 15 minutes to get to it looked to be about an hour-long video, but this one shouldn't be. So I'm going to copy and paste a lot of it across. So in the get client, yeah, I've got everything out. In the get client.py file, I've just pasted in a function called config user client, and we've got args and keyword arguments. Just going to save that. So what this function does, it allows us to make a call from other files and create and configure a new client for our customer. See, in the real world, in a production environment, you would that client would already have an account ID. So you'd do it in a different way, but we don't have this in the tutorial, so we need to create one. It's a fictitious one, but we need to create it nonetheless. So we pass through keyword arguments. So it's when we call this in another file in a few moments, we want to pass through the account ID and a private key. We create 2 new variables, operator ID and operator key, using the account ID and the private key that we've pulled in from Hedera. Look back at the previous videos, we talk about that in length. They're basically classes, Python classes that have been converted from Java classes. So from a string, we're creating an account ID. So this operator ID and operator key now become objects that we can make a call into for testnet. So the network for this is for testnet. And when in this client, we set the operator, and that set operator method requires objects, not strings. So this operator ID is an object, as is the operator key. And we pass them through and we return it as the customer client, right? So client is always passed through as us, that is us as client, And this one, config user client, returns another client. So we've now got the ability to use two, which is great. That's it. That's all we need for get client. We then have the create account file again. So I needed to expand on this when I was playing around earlier. So let's just go through those changes. Okay, so yeah, we need account balance. What have we got? No, we need account ID here. So we need account ID brought through from Hedera. And then in Hedera accounts, this is what we played around with last time we were in the last tutorial. So this class allows us to create this fictitious account. If you look in the create new account function, all it does is it prints out the balance of the new account and the account ID. We don't want to do that. We want this function, or sorry, this method create new account to return the account ID, the private key, and all of the kind of necessary information so we can actually do something with it. So what I'll do, I will quickly amend this with the class that I've not got on the other screen. So I've just pasted it across. No changes on the init the dunder init function, but the create new account function is slightly different. Okay, so we are same here, no different. So that this is exactly the same, but instead of printing the balance and printing the account ID, we're now returning a dictionary with the account ID, public key, private key, and balance. So we can now make a call to this class and get that information when we create a new file, which we will in a minute, and it'll be called transfer py. And then I've got another class that I put together because it will become very, very helpful having this class. It's called Hedera data. I've got a dunder init function, which we pass a few things to, but essentially we've got two methods. One's called balance and one's called get cost. So this balance method will be called from a client to get the starting balance and the ending balance. Okay, so that's what this is for. And the get cost will eventually, when it works, I'll have to debug it, but that gets the actual transaction cost itself. So we pass through the account ID and the client, because remember, we've got two clients. And from those two new keywords, we can then get the balance using the account balance query. We set the account ID and then we execute. You can probably see that now. And then at the end, we get the Hbars from the balance to string. So we're creating a string essentially from that return. That's what that balance variable becomes. Same happens with cost as well. Save that. Right, yeah, so that is now the new create account py file. So we didn't get to that point when we were playing around with it in the last video, but we needed to expand on it a little bit now so that we can actually create a new file called transfer py and actually make this transfer. So it's taken nearly 13 minutes to get to this point already, but we needed to make those changes, else it would have got a little bit complicated. So file, new file, and we'll save this as, transfer.py. Okay, and there is quite a bit of code here, so I'm going to dump it in here and talk it through rather than trying to type, because this would be a very, very long video otherwise. Like I said, the link to the GitHub repository is in the description below, so you can get your hands on this code very, very easily. So, and if you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I can't type very well. When I'm being recorded, I'm okay when I'm not, but I tend to make a lot of typos. So that's got that out of the way. Let me look at my file, and I'm just simply going to paste the lot in here, and then we're going to talk through it. Okay, so first, straight off the bat, import OS. We're doing that because we need the account ID, our account ID, to be a string, not an object. So when we're importing the account ID from the client, it comes through as an object and it doesn't work. We need it as a string. So from OS, we can now use environ and get the operator ID from the environment variables. Okay, so from get client, import client. So client is us, remember, that's an object. Operator ID and operator key, again, they're objects. They're what we put together. They are what we put together in get client. Okay, so operator ID, operator key. And then we're bringing in config user client. That's the function that we just built. So that's this here. So it returns a client. So it's important to add this client here. This variable that we'll be tapping into is actually an object, but that we'll be using that later. That is us. When we call config user client, that will be our customer. From create account, we've just played around with this, Hedera account and Hedera data. They're the two classes that we just built in create account. So it's this one and this one. So we're importing those. And then from Hedera, so the SDK that we've pip installed, we need to bring in private key, account ID, account create transaction, Hbar, account balance query, and then transfer transaction. So these are the classes that are in the docs. Now I did say I wouldn't keep flicking between this and the website, but you can see here, account balance query, that's something we're importing. What else have we got? Hbar, probably there we go, Hbar, and then transfer transaction. So we need to import them. It's important, otherwise we don't do it. So we're going to replicate this in one of these classes. So essentially we need to call transfer transaction. We need to put a sending account and the amount of tiny bars, and a receiving account and amount of tiny bars. So that's what we're going to do right now. There we go. So I've got here a client mixin, so I'm going to be using that in the transfer class, but essentially it's got a dunder init function method here, and we're passing through the amount. Now the amount is tiny bars. Okay, so it's important to know that. And the description, this will be passed through to the transfer, because you can add a memo, so the actual transfer, you can say what it was for. And then we pass through the customer account ID, the customer private key, that is, we get that when we call the Hedera account class, which is here. Okay, so we pass those two strings through to the client mixin, and then from that we then call, so self client becomes config user client, which is the function that we built in the get client file, and we pass through the two strings. All right, so that's what that's doing. We pass that mixin, client mixin, into transfer, and transfer has got a one method currently called create. So this is creating a transaction. I always try to build these classes in this way so that we can actually add to them later, and it's quite easy rather than having just normal functions, which are kind of you can't do much with them. So anyway, so this is a create method. We pass through self. So let me walk through this and try to make some sense of it. So first and foremost, we're passing through tinybar. So tinybar is, what's that? That is 100 million tiny bars to each one Hbar. So a single Hbar is the equivalent of 100 million tiny bars. I think that's right. That is 100 million. Microbar is 1 million microbars to one Hbar. Okay, so they're the denominations that we're using, and we're doing it that way because you in the Hbar class you've got a from tinybars method, so you can you convert this figure into Hbar, so it becomes so we're creating a variable called tinybar conversion. So we're passing through, I think I mentioned this wrong earlier, we're passing through Hbars, so the number of Hbars that are being transferred. I think in the example we're going to be just using one. So we convert that to tiny bars. So the amount we call init. So we create an integer in Python and we multiply it by 100 million. Okay, so that Hbar now becomes 100 million tiny bars. So if we transfer 2 Hbar, that will be 200 million. Okay, so the amount is Hbar dot from tinybars. We pass through an integer tinybar conversion. So we're then making this an integer. That's really not needed, to be fair, but we've got it in there anyway. Account ID. So the account ID, which we're importing here. Account ID from string. So this is the string that we're getting from the customer account ID. So self customer account ID. Remember, we're bringing it in here. So that's how we're getting account ID. Our starting balance. So our starting balance, customer starting balance. Then what we're doing is we're creating a transfer. So we call this here because we want to know what we started off with before we even tried to transfer any Hbar between accounts. So we're calling the Hedera data. Let me move that across so you can see it. We've got a class called Hedera data. We're calling that, passing through the account ID. So remember, it needs a string. So for ours, I'm passing operating system environ operator ID. That brings through that string. And then client equals client, because client is us, remember. Self.client is our customer. And then dot balance, so we're calling a balance method. That will return a balance string. Same goes for the customer starting balance. That will bring through a balance, and it should be, I think it's 100. When we start, that was another thing I actually changed on the create account quickly. When we create an account, we're creating it with, what's that? That is 10 billion tiny bars, right? So that would be 100 Hbar if my maths is correct. I think we create the account with 100 Hbar. Right, okay, so that's what we're doing. So that balance should be whatever because as a testnet user, I think they give you 10,000 Hbar every single day, and it just the slate is wiped every day, and you get 10,000 more. So my balance will be whatever my balance is after I've done some testing, but the customer start balance will be 100. We then create this transfer transaction. Now this is exactly the same as it is in the docs, other than I've added the dot set transaction memo. You don't need to do that, but I'm doing it anyway. So the first instance here is the sending client. The second instance here is the receiving client. So the first one is account ID. Remember, that is our customer. And the amount is the amount here negated. So we call a dot negated. That makes that -2. Yeah. And the amount in here is +2. So it's -2, +2. It needs to be identical, else it just won't work. So first line, sending, second line, receiving, set transaction memo. This is the description, and then execute. So you have to execute this using the client object of the sender. So in this case, it is our client. So we have to put self.client. If I just put client in there, it won't work. Client is also an object, but that's us, and we're the receiver. So if we turn this on its bottom, and I was sending Hbar to a client, it would be my client object in there, and the receiver and the sender would switch around. Okay, I hope I've explained that well enough. So I've actually got the notes here. Notice that we're using self.client from the Dunder in it. Okay, so I've explained that. So status. So this is this will give us the status of the transaction where it's reached consensus. So that is what we need. So we're calling receipt, which is the object we just made here. We call get receipt, pass through self client, and then we get the status to string, right? And then transaction ID, receipt, get record, pass through the client, and then dot transaction ID. So we need those because we're going to pass them through as a string in a second. So then we've got, if it was a success, else do something. So the else is something went wrong, print message. So if it doesn't work, we're going to have this. It's going to kick out the else statement. But if it is a success, if the transaction works and we don't bugger anything up, this is what we'll see. So we've got the transaction ID is tran ID to string. And then our end balance, so we call Hedera balance again. We do the same again for customer, except we call two methods. So we create cust, and then we call cust, and then the balance method, and then we call cust get cost. That will give us our fee. But you can see here I've just done a rudimental second customer cost, which is basically their starting balance minus their end balance. And then you multiply it by 100 million to get the tinybar. So it's because I couldn't get it to work. It was always showing 0 as a fee, when in actual fact there was a fee. So, and then we're doing 5 print statements. So the transaction was a success, then the transaction ID. So it will show us the transaction was a success. The transaction ID is this. The customer Hbar balance went down from X to Y. And the receiving, our balance went up from X to Y, and the fee was whatever. So it's 5 statements just to explain what we've actually done. So the fact if we get those printing out, we're cooking on gas. So that is the transfer class. Next, we've got manage transfer. So this is the class that we're going to call to make this all happen. So we're going to call manage transfer in the shell, and we're going to pass through an amount and a description. And then from that, you can see here, we're creating an account. So we're calling the Hedera account, create new account. And it then creates these 3 variables here. So from what we're returning a dictionary, if you remember, it will get the account ID, the public key, and the private key. Then we've got make transfer. So we call the transfer class and we pass through the amount, or whatever the amount's going to be. So we're going to be passing through probably 2. We'll pass through a description up here. And then what we're doing, passing through the account ID and a private key. So they are all the variables, all the keyword arguments that we need for this to work. And then we call the create method at the bottom here. So when we open up our shell and when we fire up our virtual environment and then import the necessary class and call it, we should hopefully get a few printouts to say it's working. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's open up my command prompt. So you can see here I've CD'd into development, CD'd into Hedera Demo 3, which is what I'm currently working on, and I fired up the virtual environment called Hedera because that has got the necessary libraries in it. So what we'll do, we'll go py, and that should allow us to now work with the files that we've just done. So we will say from, hang on, what are we doing here? So from transfer, import, what do we call it? We called it manage transfer, okay. When this does fire up, it will take a couple of seconds because although I think reaching finality and consensus only takes about 5 seconds, it's very, very quick in a grand scheme of things. What this is doing much more than just a simple transfer. It's creating accounts, it's configuring clients and things like that. So it will take about 5 to 10 seconds to work. So what we'll do is we will call manage transfer and we will say amount equals 2, and then we'll say description equals test, and then we will, what do we call it? Was it create? Oh no, it's make transfer. Will it work? Will it work first time? That's the important thing. I'm nervous. Hey, there we go. That's fantastic. I'm happy with that. It should have worked first time because I was playing around with it earlier and it worked lovely in the other project. So the transaction was a success. Transaction ID, gobbledygook, but that's the ID of the transaction. The customer Hbar balance went down from 100. Remember, we set it to what was it? 100 million. I forget what it was, but we passed through. Let's have a look. We passed through in the get accounts 10 billion. So 10 billion Hbars, like I said, it was 100 Hbar. So we would expect that. So the balance was 100 and it's now 97.999444674 Hbar, right? So we transferred, what did I call 2? So we transferred 2, which you'd expect that to be 98. And then obviously there's a fee that's been deducted as well. The customer transaction fee was 2. Right, okay. So it was. So it shows you the entire. That's what it is. I'll have to actually. That's my rudimental sum. So what I actually need to do is the result minus the actual Hbar transaction itself. So the fee was 0.005532 tiny bars. So that's my mistake, but I'll change that when I put it on GitHub. And then our balance, which is the most important part, went up from 8197 to 8199. So it went up by 2 Hbar. Customers went down by 2 plus a fee. Ours went up by 2 without a fee. Perfect. We've done exactly what we set out to do. It has taken nearly 30 minutes to create this video. Sorry it's taken a little bit longer than normal, but there was quite a lot of code to do. Like I say, the link to this repository, this GitHub repository, will be in the description below. So you can just take that code and do whatever you want with it. But look, I'm over the moon that actually worked, because normally it takes me 2 or 3 attempts. So that is the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you found it valuable. Please drop me a comment, see if let me know if you liked it or if there's something else that you want me to work on. But for now, that's the end of this video. If you haven't, or if this is the first time that you've visited Decoding before, just to remind you, please click subscribe and the bell so you're notified every time I add a video. But in the meantime, that's it. See you later. I'll be seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.